It is 4:58 in the morning, and a gym on the edge of an empty parking lot has exactly one car parked outside it. Inside, under a single row of buzzing fluorescent lights, one person is already moving through their first set, completely alone, completely unwatched, completely unrewarded by anyone who will ever see this specific moment happen. No crowd, no applause, no one keeping score. And here is the question this entire audiobook exists to answer. The question that separates two people who start the exact same fitness journey on the exact same day with the exact same goals written on the exact same piece of paper. 1 year from now, one of them will be standing in that same gym, transformed, stronger, leaner, sharper, almost unrecognizable to the people who knew them a year earlier. The other one will have quietly stopped showing up sometime around week 3, the gym membership still being charged to their card every single month, a quiet, recurring reminder of an intention that simply never survived contact with real life. What actually separates these two people is not talent, it is not genetics, it is not even, and this is the part most people get completely wrong, motivation. Motivation is the thing almost everyone assumes is the missing ingredient, the thing people wait for before lacing up their shoes, the thing they search for in pump-up videos and inspirational quotes at 11 o'clock at night when tomorrow's workout feels impossible to imagine actually happening. And here is the uncomfortable truth this audiobook is going to spend the next 19 chapters proving to you in detail. Motivation was never actually the variable that mattered. The people who transform their bodies and their lives are not the people who feel more motivated than everyone else. They are the people who built something else entirely, something far less exciting to talk about, far less inspiring to post online, and far more powerful than motivation could ever hope to be. That something is discipline, and discipline does not feel like anything at all most days. It does not arrive with a rush of inspiration or a surge of energy. It simply shows up, quietly, repeatedly, on the days you feel like training, and on the days you absolutely do not. And it is that exact quality, the showing up regardless of feeling, that this audiobook is going to break down completely, piece by piece, until you understand precisely how to build it inside your own life, starting today. We are going to walk through the actual psychology behind why motivation fails almost everyone who relies on it. We are going to expose the specific neurological mechanisms that make habits stick or collapse. We are going to examine exactly what happens in the brain and the body during the most dangerous moment of any fitness journey, the moment right before most people quit, usually weeks before any visible results would have finally appeared. And we are going to walk through the precise mental architecture used by people who train consistently for years, even decades, the architecture that makes their behavior look almost boring and automatic from the outside, while producing results that look, to everyone watching, like something close to a superhuman transformation. None of this requires extraordinary willpower, a perfect personality, or some rare genetic gift for self-control. It requires understanding a few specific principles correctly, and then applying them with the kind of patience most people give up on far too early. But before any of those principles can make sense, we have to first tear down the single biggest myth standing between you and the version of yourself currently waiting on the other side of consistent discipline. The myth that has quietly sabotaged more fitness goals than any other single factor in the history of human self-improvement. Chapter 2. Here is the myth, stated as plainly as possible. Most people believe that successful, consistent training requires feeling motivated, and that the absence of motivation on any given day is a legitimate, reasonable signal to skip that day's workout. This belief feels so obviously true to most people that they never even pause to examine it directly, and that is exactly why it remains so quietly destructive. Motivation is, at its core, an emotional state, a temporary surge of enthusiasm and energy generated by the brain's chemical reward systems, frequently triggered by something new, something exciting, something recently imagined in vivid, hopeful detail. This is precisely why motivation tends to spike so dramatically at the very beginning of any new fitness journey, the first day after a New Year's resolution, the first week after watching an inspiring transformation video, the first morning after a difficult conversation with a doctor finally convinces someone that real change is necessary. The brain floods with anticipation, the future self feels vivid and achievable, and for a short period, showing up to train feels almost effortless, even enjoyable. And then, inevitably, predictably, that same motivation begins to fade, not because the person failed in some moral sense, but because motivation, by its very biological nature, is never designed to remain at peak intensity indefinitely. Neuroscientists who study reward and dopamine consistently describe motivation as something closer to a wave than a stable, reliable resource, rising sharply in response to novelty and anticipated reward, then gradually receding as the activity becomes familiar, repetitive, and no longer chemically novel to a brain that is constantly, automatically adjusting its sensitivity to any repeated stimulus. This is not a flaw unique to people who eventually quit their fitness goals. It is a universal feature of how human motivation actually works, biologically, for every single person who has ever attempted any long-term behavior change in the history of the species. The person training alone in that empty gym at 5 in the morning is not experiencing some constant, unbroken wave of motivation that the person who quit in week 3 simply failed to access. They are almost certainly experiencing the exact same fluctuating, unreliable motivation everyone else experiences, rising on some days, completely absent on others, occasionally even tilting into outright dread or resistance before a particularly difficult session. The difference has never actually been about who feels more motivated. It has been about what each person does on the days when motivation simply fails to show up at all, which, for absolutely everyone who trains consistently over a long period of time, turns out to be the overwhelming majority of all training days across an entire year. This single realization, once it is genuinely understood and internalized rather than simply heard and quickly forgotten, changes the entire framework through which someone can approach their own fitness journey. The goal stops being the impossible, biologically unrealistic pursuit of permanent motivation, a goal nobody in human history has ever actually achieved for more than a brief stretch of time. The goal becomes building a separate, far more reliable system that continues functioning correctly precisely on the days when motivation has completely, predictably, and entirely normally disappeared, a system this audiobook is about to define with complete clarity, because understanding the difference between this system and ordinary motivation may be the single most important distinction in the entire psychology of long-term physical transformation. Chapter 3. Discipline, properly understood, is not a stronger, more intense version of motivation. It is a fundamentally different psychological mechanism altogether, one that does not depend on feeling enthusiastic, energized, or inspired in order to function correctly. Discipline is the capacity to follow through on a previously made decision, regardless of the emotional state present in the current moment, and that single distinction, decision made in advance versus emotion experienced right now, explains almost everything about why some people train consistently for decades while others quit within weeks, despite starting with identical goals and identical initial enthusiasm. Consider the actual mechanics of what happens inside a disciplined person's mind on a morning when motivation is completely, genuinely absent. The alarm feels unbearable, the bed feels irresistible, and every reasonable internal voice is generating perfectly plausible excuses for skipping that day's training session entirely. A person relying purely on motivation experiences this moment as an open question, a genuine decision still actively being made in real time, weighing the discomfort of getting up against the discomfort of skipping, a negotiation that, on a low motivation morning, the bed will statistically win far more often than not, simply because immediate physical comfort almost always outweighs an abstract, distant future benefit when the brain is forced into an active, real-time comparison between the two. A genuinely disciplined person experiences this exact same moment completely differently, not because they feel any less tired or any less tempted by the bed, but because the decision itself was never actually being made in that moment at all. The decision was made days, weeks, or months earlier when that person decided, as a settled matter of identity and commitment, that training happens on scheduled days, regardless of how any particular morning happens to feel. This is precisely why discipline so often looks, from the outside, almost boring, mechanical, even slightly robotic, because it genuinely is closer to following a predetermined rule than continuously redeciding a fresh emotional question every single day. This reframing matters enormously because it reveals exactly where the real psychological work of building discipline actually needs to happen. It does not happen in the difficult moment itself, standing at the edge of the bed at 5 in the morning, trying to summon enough willpower to overcome an entire body's worth of resistance through sheer force of effort. By the time someone reaches that exact moment, the outcome has already been substantially determined by decisions made earlier, sometimes days earlier, about scheduling, environment, identity, and commitment. The real work happens earlier, in the calm, rational moments when emotion is not actively working against the decision, deciding clearly and specifically when training will happen, removing as much friction and ambiguity as possible from that decision, and then treating the resulting plan as a fixed, non-negotiable commitment, rather than a flexible suggestion subject to renegotiation based on how any particular morning happens to feel. This is the actual architecture of discipline, decisions made once, in advance, during calm, clear-headed moments, then simply executed repeatedly, without requiring fresh motivation or fresh willpower at the actual moment of execution. And understanding this architecture in detail is precisely where this audiobook is headed next. Starting with the single most powerful psychological force available to anyone hoping to build it, the same force that quietly multiplies small, consistent actions into transformations large enough to leave an entire year of progress looking almost unbelievable in hindsight. Chapter 4. There is a mathematical principle hiding underneath every successful long-term fitness transformation, a principle that explains why the actual day-to-day experience of training consistently often feels almost disappointingly unremarkable, even while the cumulative results, viewed across an entire year, look dramatic enough to make other people assume something extraordinary must have happened. That principle is compounding, the same underlying force that governs long-term financial growth, except applied directly to the human body and the nervous system instead of a brokerage account. A single workout, evaluated entirely in isolation, produces almost no visible change whatsoever. Muscles do not noticeably grow after one session. Cardiovascular endurance does not meaningfully improve after one run. Body composition does not shift in any way a mirror could actually detect after a single disciplined day of consistent eating and training. Evaluated purely on its own immediate, isolated merits, any single workout looks like an almost pointless expenditure of energy and discomfort, producing a result so small it barely registers as measurable progress at all. This is precisely why so many people abandon their fitness goals so early, because they are unconsciously evaluating each individual session against an unrealistic, immediate standard, expecting visible, satisfying proof of progress after each single workout, and feeling genuinely discouraged when that proof predictably fails to appear on schedule. But compounding does not actually work through any single isolated action. It works through the accumulated, repeated stacking of many small actions across an extended period of time, each one contributing a small, individually unremarkable amount of adaptation, until enough of those small contributions have stacked on top of one another that the combined, cumulative effect finally becomes large enough to notice, and eventually large enough to become genuinely dramatic. A person training consistently 4 or 5 times a week is not actually experiencing 4 or 5 separate, isolated events each week. They are experiencing one continuous ongoing process of adaptation that simply happens to be delivered through individual sessions, a process where each session functions less like an independent unit of progress and more like a single deposit into a long-term account that continues quietly accumulating value in the background, almost entirely invisible to direct daily observation, until enough time has passed for that accumulated value to finally become impossible to ignore. This is exactly why the actual lived experience of building real, lasting fitness almost universally feels boring, slow, and frustratingly uneventful for a considerably longer stretch of time than most people expect or feel prepared for when they first begin. The visible payoff that eventually justifies all of that accumulated effort tends to arrive considerably later than the effort itself, creating a dangerous gap between when the hard work actually begins and when the reward for that hard work finally becomes visible enough to provide its own independent motivation to continue. This gap, the extended period where genuine progress is quietly happening at the cellular and neurological level while remaining almost completely invisible to the naked eye and the bathroom scale, represents the single most dangerous stretch of any fitness journey, the exact territory where the overwhelming majority of people who eventually quit actually make that decision. Almost always far closer to an eventual breakthrough than they ever realize at the time, a specific, well-documented psychological phenomenon this audiobook is about to examine in close, careful detail. Chapter 5. Researchers and coaches who study long-term behavior change have given a specific name to the dangerous gap described in the previous chapter, often referring to it as the Valley of Disappointment, a period that begins almost immediately after the initial burst of motivation, fades and continues for a considerably longer stretch of time than most people expect, right up until accumulated, compounding progress finally becomes visible enough to provide its own independent source of encouragement. Picture this valley as a literal dip on a graph, a line representing expected progress that most people imagine rising in a smooth, steady, encouraging upward slope from the very first day of training onward, set directly against a second line representing actual, real progress, a line that, for a frustratingly long initial stretch, remains almost completely flat, showing little visible change despite genuine effort being faithfully invested into every single session along the way. The gap between these two lines, between optimistic expectation and disappointing early reality, is exactly where the emotional experience of training consistently turns dangerous for almost everyone who has ever attempted serious, sustained physical transformation. A person enters this valley already running on borrowed initial motivation, the same fading emotional wave examined back in Chapter 2, and as that motivation continues declining while visible results stubbornly refuse to appear on the expected accelerated schedule, the natural, deeply human conclusion most people eventually reach is that something about their specific approach simply is not working, that perhaps they lack whatever special quality other, apparently more successful people clearly possess, or that the entire effort was somehow misguided from the very beginning. This conclusion feels completely reasonable and emotionally honest in the moment it arrives, and it is also, almost without exception, entirely wrong because the actual underlying biological and neurological adaptations driving eventual visible transformation have been quietly accumulating the entire time, completely independent of how discouraging or uneventful the experience has felt from the inside. Muscle fibers undergo microscopic structural changes from the very first session, changes invisible to any mirror or measuring tape, but genuinely real, genuinely cumulative, and genuinely necessary precursors to the eventually visible transformation everyone is actually chasing. Cardiovascular efficiency improves at the cellular level long before it becomes noticeable during an actual workout. Neural pathways controlling movement patterns and motor coordination strengthen and refine themselves through repetition long before that refinement translates into visibly improved performance. The Valley of Disappointment is not actually evidence that nothing is happening. It is evidence that something is happening at a pace and a location, deep inside cells and neural pathways, that simply has not yet crossed the threshold required to become externally visible and emotionally satisfying. This single reframe, understanding the Valley of Disappointment as an expected, universal, temporary phase of every successful transformation rather than as personal evidence of failure or inadequacy, represents one of the single most psychologically protective pieces of knowledge anyone pursuing serious fitness goals can possibly carry with them into their own training. The people who eventually emerge on the other side of this valley, visibly transformed, dramatically stronger, are almost never the people who experienced some special, accelerated version of progress unavailable to everyone else. They are simply the people who kept training consistently through the exact same uneventful, discouraging stretch that causes almost everyone else to quit, usually within weeks, sometimes within mere days, of when their own breakthrough would have eventually arrived. Chapter 6. Surviving the Valley of Disappointment requires something more durable than simply gritting one's teeth and white-knuckling through pure willpower alone, because willpower, much like motivation, turns out to be a genuinely limited, fluctuating resource rather than a stable, unlimited supply available equally on every single day, regardless of stress, sleep, or circumstance. The actual solution, the one used consistently by people who train for years and decades rather than weeks, involves a deliberate shift in identity, a change not in what someone does, but in how someone fundamentally describes who they are to themselves, internally, in the quiet, unobserved moments when nobody else is listening to that internal narration at all. There is a meaningful, measurable psychological difference between someone who says to themselves, internally, "I am trying to get into better shape," and someone who says, instead, "I am someone who trains," a difference that might initially sound like nothing more than semantic wordplay, but actually reflects two entirely different underlying relationships with the same physical behavior. The first framing positions the behavior as a temporary, goal-directed project, something undertaken in pursuit of a specific external outcome, weight loss, visible muscle, an upcoming event, a doctor's recommendation, a framing that by its very nature becomes psychologically optional the moment that specific external outcome feels achieved, abandoned, or simply less urgent than it did at the original moment of decision. The second framing positions the exact same behavior as a fixed, ongoing expression of personal identity, something a person simply does because of who they fundamentally understand themselves to be, independent of any specific external outcome or any particular day's results, a framing that, once genuinely internalized, removes the behavior almost entirely from the realm of daily negotiation and active decision-making. A person who identifies as someone who trains does not wake up each morning facing a fresh, open question about whether today happens to be a training day, weighed against competing priorities and current mood. The question has already been permanently answered by their underlying self-concept, and the actual daily decision shrinks down to nothing more than logistics when exactly the session will happen, rather than whether it will happen at all. This is precisely why experienced, long-term trainees so often describe their own consistency using language that sounds almost dismissive of how difficult the behavior originally felt to maintain. Statements like simply not really thinking about it anymore, or it just being part of who I am, language that sounds, to someone still struggling in their own early valley of disappointment, almost unbelievably effortless and unattainable. It is not actually unattainable. It is the predictable, well-documented outcome of sustained behavior eventually reshaping underlying self-concept, a process psychologists studying habit and identity formation have observed and described consistently across decades of research into long-term behavior change. The practical implication for anyone listening to this audiobook right now, still standing somewhere inside their own valley of disappointment, is this: stop waiting to feel like the kind of person who trains consistently before beginning to act like one. The identity shift does not reliably precede the consistent behavior. It follows it, gradually, through sustained repetition, meaning the actual fastest, most reliable path toward genuinely identifying as a disciplined, consistent trainee runs directly through continuing to show up, repeatedly, specifically during the exact uncomfortable stretch when that identity still feels completely unearned and entirely unfamiliar. Chapter 7. Beyond identity, there is a second, equally powerful lever available to anyone hoping to survive the valley of disappointment and build genuine long-term discipline, a lever that operates not on internal psychology directly, but on the external environment and structure surrounding any planned behavior, dramatically reducing the amount of willpower required to actually execute it consistently. Behavioral scientists who study habit formation have repeatedly found that the single most reliable predictor of whether a planned behavior actually gets completed is not the strength of someone's underlying motivation or commitment, but rather the amount of friction standing between the intention and the actual execution of that intention. Friction, in this context, refers to any small obstacle, inconvenience, or additional decision point standing between a person and the behavior they have already decided to perform, and even seemingly minor amounts of friction turn out to dramatically reduce follow-through rates, particularly on exactly the kind of low motivation days when discipline, rather than enthusiasm, is required to carry someone through. Consider the practical difference between two people who have each genuinely committed, the previous evening, to training first thing the following morning. The first person leaves their workout clothes scattered somewhere in a drawer, their gym bag unpacked, their pre-workout routine entirely undefined, leaving every single one of these small logistical decisions to be made fresh in the groggy, low willpower state of early morning, exactly the state in which decision-making and self-control are measurably weaker than at almost any other point during a typical day. The second person lays their workout clothes out the night before, packs their gym bag completely, perhaps even sets their alarm clock physically across the room rather than within arm's reach of the snooze button, removing several small decision points and small physical obstacles entirely before they ever become relevant the following morning. On a day when motivation happens to be high for both people, this difference in preparation likely matters very little, since strong motivation alone can usually overcome even moderate amounts of friction without much conscious effort. But on the considerably more common day when motivation is low, tired, distracted, or simply absent, that small amount of removed friction frequently makes the entire difference between a completed workout and a skipped one, precisely because discipline, unlike motivation, does not need to overcome large obstacles through sheer force of willpower if those obstacles have already been deliberately engineered out of existence in advance. This principle extends considerably beyond simply preparing clothing and equipment the night before. It applies to choosing a gym location close enough to home or work that the commute itself does not become its own significant source of friction. It applies to scheduling training sessions at a fixed, consistent time each day, removing the need to actively negotiate timing fresh with oneself every single morning or evening. It applies to finding a training partner or a scheduled class with a fixed start time, introducing external social commitment that makes skipping considerably more psychologically costly than it would be if the only person aware of a missed session was the person who missed it. Each of these small adjustments shares the same underlying mechanism, deliberately reducing the number of moments where active willpower is required to keep moving forward, recognizing honestly that willpower is a limited, fluctuating resource, and building an environment that simply requires less of it in order to produce the exact same consistent behavior, day after day, regardless of how any particular morning happens to feel. Chapter 8. There is a particular kind of discomfort embedded inside every genuinely effective training session, a discomfort that most people instinctively try to avoid, manage, or minimize, and yet this exact discomfort turns out to be one of the single most valuable, transferable assets a consistent training practice can ever produce, an asset that extends far beyond the gym and directly into every other difficult area of an entire human life. Physical training, when performed at a genuinely productive intensity, requires a person to continue pushing through a rising tide of physical discomfort, fatigue, and an increasingly loud internal voice suggesting that stopping right now would be perfectly reasonable and justified. Learning to tolerate this specific discomfort repeatedly without immediately obeying the urge to stop the moment it first appears builds something psychologists sometimes refer to as distress tolerance, the learned capacity to remain functional and continue taking deliberate action even while experiencing genuinely uncomfortable internal sensations, rather than allowing those sensations to immediately dictate behavior the moment they arise. This capacity, once built consistently inside the relatively controlled, contained environment of a gym, does not actually remain confined to that specific environment. It transfers, measurably and repeatedly, into other difficult domains of life entirely unrelated to physical training, difficult conversations that require staying calm and present despite genuine emotional discomfort, demanding work projects that require sustained focus despite mental fatigue, personal challenges that require continued forward motion despite the very human urge to retreat the moment things become genuinely uncomfortable. This transfer effect explains, at least in part, why so many people who commit seriously to consistent physical training report noticeable improvements in unrelated areas of their lives, improved focus at work, improved patience in relationships, improved resilience during unexpected setbacks, improvements that have very little to do with the physical fitness itself and everything to do with the underlying distress tolerance that consistent, demanding training quietly builds session after session. It is worth being precise and honest here about exactly what this principle does and does not mean, because there is a meaningful, important difference between productive discomfort, the kind that builds genuine capacity and adaptation over time, and harmful pain, the kind that signals genuine injury or risk and should never simply be pushed through regardless of the cost. Productive discomfort feels like effort, fatigue, and the natural, expected resistance of muscles and lungs being asked to work harder than they are immediately comfortable working. Harmful pain feels sharp, localized, and qualitatively different from ordinary fatigue, and learning to distinguish clearly between these two categories represents an essential, non-negotiable skill for anyone hoping to build a sustainable, long-term training practice rather than a short-lived burst of reckless effort that eventually ends in genuine injury and forced, often lengthy, interruption. With that important distinction clearly established, the broader principle still holds. A person who never allows themselves to experience and tolerate the ordinary, expected discomfort of genuine physical effort never actually builds the underlying distress tolerance that makes consistent long-term discipline sustainable in the first place, remaining instead permanently dependent on training only during the relatively rare moments when motivation happens to make that discomfort feel acceptable and worthwhile. The people who eventually transform their bodies and their lives are not the people who somehow stopped experiencing this discomfort altogether. They are the people who built, deliberately and repeatedly, a working relationship with that discomfort that allows them to continue moving forward through it consistently, regardless of how unpleasant any single specific session happens to feel in the moment it is actually being endured. Chapter 9. To understand exactly how repeated behavior eventually transforms from something requiring conscious, effortful decision-making into something that happens almost automatically, it helps to examine what is actually happening inside the brain during the formation of any genuine habit, a process neuroscientists have studied extensively and described with remarkable consistency across decades of research. Every habit, including the habit of consistent physical training, follows a recognizable underlying structure built around three connected components: a cue that signals the beginning of a particular behavior, a routine representing the actual behavior itself, and a reward that follows the completed behavior and reinforces the connection between the original cue and the resulting routine. In the earlier stages of building any new training habit, this entire loop requires significant conscious effort and active decision-making at every single step. The cue must be consciously noticed and interpreted. The routine must be consciously chosen and executed despite competing impulses. And the reward, often delayed and abstract early on, must be consciously remembered and connected back to the effort that produced it. This is precisely why new habits feel so genuinely exhausting and fragile during their earliest weeks, because the brain is essentially running this entire three-part process manually, consuming considerable mental energy and willpower with every single repetition. Over time, however, with sufficient consistent repetition, something measurable begins happening at the neurological level. The specific neural pathways associated with this particular cue, routine, and reward sequence gradually strengthen through a well-documented process neuroscientists call long-term potentiation, essentially the brain's way of making frequently used pathways more efficient and more automatic with continued use. Similar to how a frequently walked path through tall grass eventually becomes a clearly defined trail requiring far less conscious navigation than the very first time someone walked through that same unmarked field. This gradual neurological strengthening explains why consistent training eventually starts to feel noticeably less effortful from a pure decision-making standpoint, even while the actual physical effort involved in each individual workout may remain just as demanding as it always was. The exhaustion in the earliest weeks of a new training habit comes disproportionately from the mental and emotional effort of constantly, consciously deciding to perform the behavior, far more than from the physical effort of the behavior itself. And this specific category of exhaustion, the decision-making exhaustion rather than the physical exhaustion, is precisely the category that eventually fades as the underlying neural pathway becomes more established and automatic through sustained repetition. Research examining exactly how long this neurological transition typically takes has produced varied results depending on the specific behavior and the specific individual involved, generally suggesting a process that unfolds gradually over a period of months rather than the popularized, oversimplified claims sometimes circulated suggesting habits form reliably within some fixed, universal number of weeks. This realistic timeline matters enormously for anyone listening to this audiobook who may have previously expected training to start feeling significantly easier after some specific, popularly cited short window, only to feel discouraged and quietly convinced something was uniquely wrong with their own particular effort when that easier feeling failed to materialize on the expected accelerated schedule. The actual, honest timeline is considerably longer and considerably more individual than popular shortcuts typically suggest, and understanding this realistic timeline in advance removes one more potential source of premature discouragement during exactly the extended stretch when continued consistency matters most. Chapter 10. Mental toughness, a term frequently used in discussions of athletic and physical discipline, is sometimes mistakenly imagined as some fixed, inborn personality trait that certain fortunate people simply possess from birth while others permanently lack, an assumption that turns out to be considerably less accurate than the actual research on this exact topic suggests. Mental toughness, examined closely, appears far more accurately described as a learnable skill built primarily through the deliberate management of internal self-talk, the continuous, often unconscious internal narration running through every person's mind during moments of genuine physical or emotional difficulty. Two people experiencing the exact same level of physical fatigue partway through a genuinely demanding training session can have dramatically different internal experiences of that identical physical sensation, based almost entirely on the specific internal narrative each person happens to be running in response to it. One internal narrative might sound something like this: cannot continue, this is too difficult, something is clearly wrong, I should stop immediately, a narrative that tends to amplify the perceived intensity of physical discomfort and accelerates the likelihood of premature quitting considerably earlier than genuine physical limitation would otherwise require. A different internal narrative, responding to the exact same physical sensation, might instead sound something closer to "this is uncomfortable, this is exactly what productive effort is supposed to feel like, I have felt this exact sensation before and successfully continued through it," a narrative that tends to reduce the perceived intensity of the same physical discomfort and meaningfully extends the point at which genuine quitting actually becomes necessary or appropriate. This difference is not simply a matter of positive thinking applied superficially as some kind of motivational decoration layered on top of physical effort. It reflects a genuine, measurable psychological mechanism where interpretation and framing directly influence perceived effort and perceived discomfort, which in turn directly influences actual behavioral persistence during genuinely difficult moments. Sports psychologists who work directly with competitive athletes frequently spend considerable time specifically training this internal narrative, helping athletes notice unhelpful, defeatist self-talk patterns as they arise in real time, and deliberately, consciously replacing them with more accurate, more functional alternative framings, not through denial of genuine difficulty, but through more useful interpretation of that same genuine difficulty. This same deliberate practice remains available to anyone training consistently outside of competitive athletics entirely, and it begins with the simple, often surprisingly difficult first step of actually noticing one's own internal narrative during difficult moments, rather than experiencing that narrative passively as simply an accurate, unquestionable description of objective reality. Most people have never consciously examined the specific language their own mind uses during moments of genuine physical or emotional strain. Having absorbed certain default narrative patterns so early and so consistently that those patterns now feel like simple, neutral fact rather than one possible interpretation among several genuinely available alternatives. Building genuine mental toughness begins with this basic noticing, paying close, deliberate attention to exactly what internal language arises during a difficult set, a difficult mile, a difficult final few repetitions, and then consciously, deliberately practicing an alternative, more functional version of that same internal narrative, repeated consistently enough, across enough difficult sessions, that the more functional version gradually becomes the new automatic default, exactly the same underlying neurological process responsible for building any other consistent, automatic habit described earlier in this audiobook. Chapter 11. No examination of discipline and consistent training would be complete without addressing the powerful role other people play in determining whether any individual person's commitment actually survives long enough to produce real, lasting transformation, because human behavior, including the specific behavior of consistent physical training, turns out to be considerably more socially influenced than most people initially assume when picturing fitness as a purely individual, private pursuit. Research examining behavior change across large groups of people has consistently found that social environment functions as one of the single strongest predictors of whether any new healthy habit actually sticks over an extended period of time, frequently mattering as much or more than an individual's own personal willpower, motivation, or even their underlying knowledge about proper training technique and program design. This influence operates through several distinct mechanisms worth examining directly. The first is straightforward accountability, the simple, measurable difference between skipping a training session that exists purely as a private commitment known only to oneself versus skipping a training session that someone else, a training partner, a coach, a scheduled class instructor, is actively expecting to see completed. Private commitments, by their very nature, can be silently renegotiated and abandoned without any external social consequence whatsoever, while commitments witnessed or expected by another person introduce a genuine social cost to skipping, a cost that frequently provides exactly enough additional motivation to push through low willpower moments that a purely private commitment would have failed to survive. The second mechanism is modeling, the well-documented psychological tendency for individuals to unconsciously adjust their own behavior and expectations to match the behavior and expectations of people they regularly spend time around. A person who spends significant time around others who train consistently, who treat physical effort as a normal, expected, unremarkable part of daily life, gradually absorbs that same normalized expectation into their own internal sense of what a typical day or week is supposed to look like, while a person surrounded primarily by others who treat exercise as rare, difficult, or exceptional tends to absorb that opposite framing instead, regardless of either person's original individual intentions or stated goals. The third mechanism is genuine emotional and practical support during exactly the difficult periods this audiobook has already examined in detail. The valley of disappointment, the early weeks of habit formation requiring excessive conscious willpower, the inevitable setbacks and interruptions that occur across any sufficiently long training journey. A person navigating these difficult periods entirely alone faces them with only their own individual psychological resources available, while a person navigating the exact same difficult periods alongside genuine social support, whether a training partner, a coach, an online community, or simply a friend who consistently asks how training is going, has access to encouragement, perspective, and practical problem solving that meaningfully increases the odds of successfully continuing through to the other side. This does not mean that consistent training absolutely requires a formal training partner or expensive personal coaching in order to succeed, since plenty of people do successfully build lasting discipline entirely on their own, relying primarily on the identity-based and environmental strategies examined in earlier chapters. It does mean that deliberately seeking out some genuine form of social accountability, connection, or community, even something as simple as sharing specific goals with a few trusted friends or joining a regularly scheduled group class, meaningfully improves the underlying odds of survival through exactly the difficult periods most likely to otherwise end a fitness journey prematurely, long before that journey would have eventually produced its own genuine, self-sustaining momentum. Chapter 12. There is a particular phenomenon worth examining directly, one that frequently surprises people who commit seriously to consistent physical training for the very first time. A phenomenon researchers studying behavior change sometimes describe using the term spillover effect, referring to the well-documented tendency for sustained discipline in one specific area of life to gradually extend outward and influence behavior in completely unrelated areas as well. A person who successfully builds the habit of training consistently 4 or 5 times a week, surviving the valley of disappointment described earlier, and pushing through to the other side where that behavior finally becomes automatic and identity-based, frequently reports noticing, almost as an unexpected side effect, improved discipline in entirely separate domains, more consistent sleep schedules, more deliberate and considered eating patterns, improved follow-through on professional projects and deadlines, even improved consistency in personal relationships and communication. This spillover effect is not simply a pleasant coincidence or an unrelated parallel improvement happening independently alongside fitness progress. Researchers studying this exact phenomenon have proposed several plausible explanations for why it occurs so consistently across so many different individuals, explanations that connect directly back to concepts already examined earlier in this audiobook. One leading explanation involves what psychologists sometimes call self-efficacy, the internal belief, built specifically through direct, repeated personal experience rather than abstract reassurance from other people, that one is genuinely capable of setting a difficult goal and successfully following through on it despite resistance, discomfort, and the natural temptation to quit prematurely. A person who successfully survives the valley of disappointment in their fitness journey accumulates direct, undeniable personal evidence that they are, in fact, the kind of person capable of sustained discipline under genuinely difficult conditions, evidence that becomes considerably harder to dismiss or doubt once it has been directly, personally experienced rather than simply imagined or hoped for in the abstract. This strengthened self-efficacy does not remain neatly confined to the specific domain of physical training where it was originally built. It generalizes outward, influencing how that same person approaches other difficult goals entirely unrelated to fitness, because the underlying belief being reinforced, I am capable of sustained discipline despite discomfort, applies just as directly to a demanding work project or a difficult personal challenge as it does to a demanding training session. A second related explanation involves the practical, structural changes that consistent training tends to introduce into someone's broader daily routine. More consistent wake times required to accommodate morning training sessions, increased general energy, and improved sleep quality that naturally support better decision-making across other areas of daily life, and reduced reliance on willpower in one domain, freeing up additional cognitive and emotional resources available for exercising discipline in other domains as well. This spillover effect offers a genuinely important piece of additional motivation for anyone listening to this audiobook who might be tempted to view consistent physical training as simply one isolated goal among many competing priorities, deserving no particular special priority over other equally valid personal or professional objectives. The actual research suggests something considerably more powerful than that framing implies, that building genuine discipline specifically through consistent physical training frequently functions as a kind of foundational domino, one that, once successfully established, makes building and sustaining discipline in entirely separate areas of life measurably easier than it would have been otherwise, a multiplying effect that extends the genuine value of consistent training considerably beyond whatever specific physical results it eventually produces on its own. Chapter 13. Despite everything this audiobook has examined so far regarding identity, environment, mental toughness, and social support, it would be dishonest and ultimately unhelpful to suggest that anyone, however well prepared and however thoroughly they understand these underlying principles, will successfully avoid every single missed session, every setback, and every temporary lapse across an entire extended training journey. Missed sessions happen to literally everyone who has ever sustained a long-term training practice, caused by illness, travel, unexpected family emergencies, overwhelming work deadlines, or simply ordinary human fatigue and occasional lapses in judgment that affect every person regardless of how genuinely committed they happen to be to their underlying goals. The actual determining factor separating people who eventually achieve lasting transformation from people who do not has far less to do with whether missed sessions occur at all, an unrealistic standard nobody actually achieves across a sufficiently long timeline, and far more to do with exactly how each person responds psychologically and behaviorally to that missed session once it has already happened and can no longer be undone. Researchers studying habit formation and relapse have identified a specific, dangerous psychological pattern that frequently determines whether a single missed session remains an isolated, inconsequential event or instead becomes the beginning of a complete, sustained collapse of the entire training habit altogether, a pattern sometimes referred to as the what the hell effect. This pattern unfolds in a remarkably consistent, predictable sequence. A person commits to a specific training schedule, then experiences a single missed session due to some legitimate or illegitimate reason, and rather than simply treating that missed session as a minor, isolated deviation from an otherwise intact plan, begins instead experiencing a disproportionate sense of having already failed entirely, reasoning, often unconsciously, along lines that sound something like, "Since I already missed yesterday, the entire week is already ruined anyway, so there is little remaining point in trying to salvage what is left of it. This specific thought pattern, the what the hell effect, transforms a single genuinely minor setback into a complete abandonment of the underlying goal, not because the original missed session itself was actually significant enough to justify quitting entirely, but because the all-or-nothing interpretation applied to that missed session created a self-fulfilling psychological permission to simply give up rather than continuing forward from wherever the plan actually currently stands. The practical antidote to this dangerous pattern, one consistently recommended by behavioral researchers and experienced coaches alike, involves adopting what is sometimes described as the never miss twice rule, a deliberately simple, easy-to-remember guideline stating that while occasionally missing a single scheduled session is essentially inevitable and should not be treated as a moral failure deserving harsh self-judgment, allowing 2 consecutive missed sessions in a row represents a meaningfully more dangerous pattern worth actively, deliberately interrupting before it has the chance to develop further momentum. This single, simple rule provides a clear, actionable line distinguishing between an acceptable normal, expected occasional lapse, and a genuinely concerning pattern beginning to take hold, removing the need for excessive self-judgment after any single missed session, while still maintaining a meaningful, concrete standard, preventing that single missed session from quietly escalating into a complete, sustained collapse of months or years of previously built consistency, exactly the kind of pragmatic, realistic standard that distinguishes people who successfully sustain discipline across an entire lifetime from people who treat any single imperfection as sufficient justification for abandoning the entire underlying effort altogether. Chapter 14. Let's return now to the empty gym this audiobook opened with, the single car parked outside in the dark, the one person training alone at 5 in the morning while the rest of their building still sleeps undisturbed. We can now understand, with considerably more precision than was available back in Chapter 1, exactly what separates this specific person from the one who quietly stopped showing up sometime around week 3 of an otherwise identical fitness journey. This person did not possess some rare, inborn reserve of motivation unavailable to everyone else attempting the exact same goal. Their motivation, examined honestly, almost certainly rose and fell across the preceding months in exactly the same unpredictable, fluctuating pattern described back in Chapter 2, present and energizing on some days, completely absent on plenty of others. What this person actually built instead was a separate, more reliable system, a genuine shift in self-identity that gradually transformed training from an optional daily decision into a fixed, settled expression of who they fundamentally understood themselves to be. They deliberately engineered their environment to reduce unnecessary friction, removing as many small obstacles as possible between intention and execution, recognizing honestly that willpower alone was never going to reliably carry them through every single low-motivation morning across an entire year of consistent effort. They survived, at some specific point along the way, their own personal valley of disappointment, continuing to show up through weeks or months of training that produced frustratingly little visible external evidence of progress, trusting that compounding adaptation was genuinely occurring beneath the surface, even when no mirror or measurement could yet confirm it directly. They built a working relationship with physical discomfort, learning to distinguish clearly between productive effort and genuine injury, and developing, through repeated direct experience, the distress tolerance that eventually made difficult sessions feel familiar and manageable rather than overwhelming and threatening. They paid close, deliberate attention to their own internal self-talk during the most difficult moments of their training, gradually replacing unhelpful, defeatist narration with more accurate, more functional alternative framing, repeated consistently enough that the more useful narrative eventually became their new automatic default. They likely built some form of genuine social accountability or support, whether a training partner, a coach, or simply a community of people who shared and reinforced their own commitment to consistent effort. And critically, when they inevitably missed a session here and there across the full span of an entire year, illness, travel, an overwhelming week at work, they almost certainly avoided falling into the dangerous all-or-nothing trap of treating that single missed session as evidence of complete failure, instead simply returning to their established routine at the very next scheduled opportunity, honoring something close to the never miss twice principle without necessarily knowing it by that specific name. None of these individual components, examined in isolation, looks particularly dramatic or impressive. Each one looks, frankly, almost boring. A small adjustment to identity here, a small reduction in environmental friction there, a slightly more functional internal narrative repeated consistently enough to eventually become automatic, but stacked together, sustained consistently across enough months and eventually enough years. These unremarkable individual components compound into something that looks, from the outside, almost unbelievable. A transformation dramatic enough that people who knew this person a year earlier frequently struggle to fully recognize them, not just physically, but in their entire bearing, their confidence, and their relationship with difficulty itself. A transformation built not from a single dramatic moment of inspiration, but from the patient, unglamorous accumulation of exactly the principles this audiobook has now walked through in complete, careful detail. Chapter 15. There is a particular danger worth addressing directly before this audiobook moves toward its final, most practically actionable chapters. A danger that has become considerably more prevalent and considerably more psychologically damaging in recent years than it was during previous decades. The danger of constant, unrelenting comparison fueled by the curated, carefully selected fitness content most people now encounter daily across social media platforms. It has never been easier to see images and videos of other people's physical transformations, their most impressive lifts, their most flattering angles, their most dramatic before and after comparisons, content specifically selected and presented to generate maximum engagement and attention, frequently representing the absolute peak moment of someone's entire journey rather than any kind of accurate, representative sample of what that journey actually looked like across its full duration, including its own private valleys of disappointment, missed sessions, and ordinary, unremarkable days. This curated content creates a particularly dangerous comparison trap for anyone currently in the early or middle stages of their own training journey, comparing their own unfiltered, ordinary, still developing reality against someone else's carefully selected, highlight reel best moment, a comparison that is, by its very structure, fundamentally unfair, and almost guaranteed to leave the person doing the comparing feeling inadequate, behind schedule, or somehow uniquely unsuccessful compared to an apparently effortless standard that, in reality, never actually existed in the way it appears to. Behavioral researchers studying the psychological impact of social comparison have consistently found that this kind of upward comparison, measuring oneself against an idealized, often unrepresentative external standard rather than against one's own previous personal baseline, tends to reduce motivation and increase discouragement, precisely the opposite of what most people instinctively assume viewing inspiring fitness content is supposed to accomplish. The actual antidote to this particular danger involves a deliberate, conscious shift in the standard being used for comparison altogether, moving away from comparing oneself against other people's curated highlights and moving instead toward comparing oneself specifically against one's own documented personal history, the version of oneself from 1 month ago, 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a comparison that, unlike comparison against a stranger's highlight reel, actually reflects genuine, accurately measured personal progress rather than an arbitrary, unfair, and often entirely fictional external benchmark. This is precisely why experienced coaches so consistently recommend some form of objective, personal tracking, whether through simple written training logs, periodic photographs taken under consistent conditions, or specific measurable performance benchmarks revisited at regular intervals, because these personal records provide a genuinely accurate, genuinely fair standard for self-comparison, directly counteracting the natural human tendency to instead measure progress against whatever impressive, unrepresentative content happens to appear most recently and most prominently across a social media feed. There is also a deeper, more foundational truth worth naming directly here, one that connects back to the identity-based framework examined earlier in this audiobook. A person whose underlying motivation for training is genuinely rooted in their own personal identity and their own personal sense of discipline and self-respect remains considerably more insulated from this particular comparison trap than a person whose motivation depends heavily on external validation, visible status, or measuring up favorably against other people's results. The goal, ultimately, has never actually been to look more impressive than anyone else's curated highlight reel. The goal has always been to become, steadily and consistently, a stronger, more disciplined, more capable version of one's own specific self, a goal that, properly understood, has no meaningful relationship whatsoever to whatever any other specific individual happens to be posting online during this exact same week. Chapter 16. There is a final, deeper refrain worth examining directly before this audiobook turns toward its concluding practical chapters. A refrain that addresses a common and entirely understandable misconception about the actual relationship between discipline and freedom. Two concepts most people instinctively assume exist in direct opposition to one another. Discipline is frequently imagined as a kind of restriction, a set of rules and constraints that limit spontaneity, limit comfort, and limit the freedom to simply do whatever feels most appealing in any given moment, a framing that makes consistent training sound, understandably, like a kind of voluntary imprisonment, rather than something genuinely worth pursuing for its own sake. This framing, while understandable, turns out to be almost exactly backward once discipline has actually been sustained long enough to produce its eventual, full effect. Consider carefully what actually happens to a person's available range of genuine choices and genuine capabilities as consistent physical discipline accumulates across months and years of sustained effort. Their physical capacity expands considerably, allowing them to participate fully and confidently in activities that would have been genuinely difficult, exhausting, or entirely impossible at an earlier, less conditioned stage of their own life, hiking a demanding trail, playing actively and energetically with their own children or grandchildren, recovering quickly and completely from an unexpected physical demand or minor injury, traveling comfortably without the constant background worry of physical limitation interfering with planned activities. Their underlying confidence and self-trust expands considerably as well, built directly from the accumulated, undeniable personal evidence that they are genuinely capable of setting and achieving difficult goals despite real resistance and real discomfort, a form of confidence that extends naturally into professional ambitions, personal relationships, and any other domain requiring sustained effort in the face of genuine difficulty. Their available energy and physical resilience expand, frequently allowing for a more active, more engaged, more fully present daily experience across every single area of life, rather than the diminished energy and the gradual physical limitation that tends to accumulate, often invisibly, for people who never build or sustain any meaningful, consistent physical practice across their adult years. None of these expanded capabilities and expanded opportunities would have been available without the underlying discipline that originally felt, especially in its earliest, most difficult weeks, like nothing more than restriction, sacrifice, and the deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable elimination of the spontaneous freedom to simply skip a session whenever skipping happened to feel more appealing than showing up. This is precisely the same underlying paradox examined in considerable detail across earlier explorations of American financial discipline in this broader audiobook series, where individuals who patiently, deliberately restricted their own immediate spending eventually unlocked a far larger, far more durable form of long-term financial freedom than they would have ever accessed by simply spending freely and immediately on every available short-term comfort and impulse. Physical discipline operates according to this exact same underlying structure. The short-term restriction, showing up to train on a difficult morning rather than simply sleeping in, eating a deliberately considered meal rather than simply consuming whatever happens to be most immediately convenient, eventually produces a considerably larger, considerably more durable form of physical and psychological freedom than the alternative path of constant, unrestricted immediate comfort could have ever realistically produced on its own. Understanding discipline correctly, not as the opposite of freedom, but as the actual mechanism through which a deeper, more durable, more capable form of freedom eventually gets built, represents one of the single most important reframes available to anyone listening to this audiobook who has ever quietly resented the apparent restriction that consistent training originally seemed to demand from them. Chapter 17. Let's now translate everything examined throughout this audiobook into a clear, practical sequence anyone listening can begin implementing immediately, regardless of current fitness level, current schedule, or how many previous attempts at consistent training may have already ended in eventual frustration and abandonment. The first practical step is deliberately defining a specific, fixed training schedule in advance during a calm, clear-headed moment, rather than relying on a fresh daily decision made in the heat of an actual low motivation moment, choosing specific days and specific times that realistically fit existing life circumstances, and then treating that schedule as a genuinely fixed commitment rather than a flexible suggestion, subject to renegotiation based on how any particular day happens to feel once it actually arrives. The second practical step is deliberately reducing environmental friction surrounding that fixed schedule, preparing clothing and equipment in advance, choosing a training location that minimizes unnecessary travel time and logistical complexity, and removing as many small avoidable obstacles as realistically possible from the specific path between intention and actual execution. The third practical step is consciously, deliberately shifting internal language away from goal-based framing centered on temporary external outcomes and toward identity-based framing centered on a stable, ongoing sense of personal identity, replacing internal statements like "I am trying to get into better shape" with statements like "I am someone who trains," repeated consistently enough, especially during the early uncomfortable weeks before that framing feels genuinely true, that it gradually becomes an accurate, settled description of an established personal identity rather than an aspirational statement about some distant, hoped-for future self. The fourth practical step involves deliberately seeking out some genuine form of social accountability or support, whether a consistent training partner, a regularly scheduled group class with a fixed, externally enforced start time, or simply sharing specific, concrete goals with a small number of trusted friends or family members likely to ask meaningful follow-up questions about actual progress. The fifth practical step is establishing some form of objective personal tracking, whether a simple written log, periodic photographs taken under genuinely consistent conditions, or specific measurable performance benchmarks revisited at clearly defined intervals, providing a genuinely accurate, fair standard for ongoing self-comparison that directly counteracts the natural human tendency toward unfair comparison against other people's curated, unrepresentative highlights. The sixth and final practical step is adopting, explicitly and deliberately, the never miss twice principle examined earlier in this audiobook, treating any single missed session as an expected, normal, inconsequential deviation, requiring no excessive self-judgment whatsoever, while still maintaining a genuine, concrete commitment to returning to the established schedule at the very next available opportunity, actively preventing the dangerous all-or-nothing collapse that has quietly ended more well-intentioned fitness journeys than almost any other single psychological pattern examined throughout this entire audiobook. None of these 6 steps require extraordinary willpower, rare genetic advantages, or some special, inborn capacity for self-control unavailable to ordinary people facing ordinary, busy, complicated lives. They require only the willingness to begin applying them consistently, starting with whatever specific schedule and circumstances currently happen to be available, and the patience to trust that the same underlying psychological and neurological mechanisms responsible for building lasting discipline in literally every documented case examined throughout the entire history of behavioral research will continue operating exactly as reliably in this specific, individual case as well, given sufficient time and sufficient consistency. Chapter 18. There is one final, essential principle this audiobook has not yet addressed directly, a principle that may initially sound somewhat contradictory to everything covered so far regarding consistency, discipline, and pushing steadily through resistance and discomfort, yet actually represents an equally essential component of any genuinely sustainable, long-term training practice. That principle is the deliberate, intentional inclusion of rest and recovery as a planned, non-negotiable part of the underlying discipline itself, rather than as a reluctant concession made only when injury or complete exhaustion has already forced the issue beyond any further reasonable avoidance. A common and genuinely dangerous misconception about discipline frames it as a kind of relentless, unbroken intensity, an endless pushing forward without pause, treating any scheduled rest day or any deliberate reduction in training intensity as a form of weakness or insufficient commitment to the underlying goal. This misconception turns out to be not just inaccurate, but genuinely counterproductive, frequently leading directly to exactly the kind of injury, burnout, and eventual complete abandonment of training altogether that this entire audiobook has been specifically designed to help anyone listening avoid. The human body, much like any other complex biological system, adapts and strengthens specifically during periods of adequate recovery following productive training stress, not during the training stress itself, meaning that genuinely adequate rest is not actually separate from or opposed to physical progress, but is instead an essential, biologically required component of that exact same progress, every bit as necessary as the training sessions themselves. A person who trains intensely every single day without exception, never allowing adequate recovery time between sessions, frequently experiences declining rather than improving performance over time, alongside dramatically increased risk of injury and a considerably higher likelihood of eventual burnout and complete training cessation, precisely the opposite outcome that genuine discipline is actually supposed to be working toward in the first place. Genuine discipline, properly understood, includes the discipline to rest deliberately and adequately when rest is genuinely required, resisting the very real psychological temptation, particularly among people who have only recently built strong training consistency, to treat every single rest day as a small moral failure or a step backward from otherwise unbroken commitment. This same principle extends to recognizing and respecting genuine warning signs of overtraining, persistent, unusual fatigue that does not resolve with normal sleep, declining rather than improving performance despite continued or increased effort, disrupted sleep patterns, and increased susceptibility to minor illness or injury, all well-documented signals that the body genuinely requires additional recovery time rather than additional pushing through discomfort. Distinguishing between this kind of genuine overtraining warning sign and the ordinary, expected discomfort of productive effort discussed earlier in this audiobook represents an essential skill that develops gradually through honest, attentive self-observation over time, and erring toward additional caution and additional rest whenever genuine uncertainty exists between these two categories represents considerably wiser, more sustainable discipline than reflexively pushing through every single signal regardless of its underlying cause. The people who train consistently for entire decades, rather than burning out dramatically within a few intense months, are almost universally people who have learned to treat strategic, deliberate rest as an equally essential, equally disciplined component of their overall practice, rather than as a reluctant departure from the genuine discipline they have otherwise worked so deliberately and so patiently to build. Chapter 19. Life, inevitably, interrupts even the most carefully constructed training systems, and any honest, complete examination of discipline must address directly how genuinely disciplined, consistent trainees actually respond when illness, injury, travel, family emergencies, or simply overwhelming life circumstances temporarily make their established routine completely impossible to maintain exactly as originally planned. The difference between someone who experiences a temporary disruption and eventually returns to consistent training, and someone who experiences that exact same disruption and never genuinely returns at all, rarely has anything to do with the severity or duration of the original disruption itself. It has everything to do with how that person psychologically frames the disruption while it is actually happening, and more importantly, how they specifically approach the process of resuming training once the disruption has genuinely passed and resuming has become realistically possible again. A particularly dangerous psychological trap, closely related to the all-or-nothing thinking examined earlier in the context of single missed sessions, frequently emerges specifically during and after extended disruptions, a trap where someone reasons, often unconsciously, that because so much time has already passed since their last consistent training session, returning now would require somehow making up for that entire lost period, or alternatively, that returning at anything less than their previous peak level of fitness and performance would somehow represent an embarrassing, unacceptable step backward, not worth attempting at all. Both of these unconscious reasoning patterns share the same underlying flaw, treating resumption as an all-or-nothing proposition requiring either a complete, immediate return to previous peak performance or no return whatsoever, rather than recognizing resumption as simply another single training session, deserving exactly the same straightforward, unremarkable treatment as any other single session within an otherwise long multi-year training journey. The actual, psychologically healthiest approach to resuming training after any genuine disruption involves deliberately, consciously lowering expectations for that first returning session considerably below whatever standard felt normal before the disruption began, treating that first session explicitly as a deliberately easy, low-pressure reintroduction rather than an immediate attempt to fully recapture previous performance levels in a single difficult attempt. This deliberate easing back into consistent training serves two genuinely important functions simultaneously. It reduces the very real physical risk of injury that comes from attempting too much too quickly after a genuine period of reduced activity, recognizing honestly that physical conditioning does decline somewhat during extended breaks and requires a reasonable, gradual rebuilding period rather than an immediate, aggressive return to previous peak levels. And it also reduces the psychological risk of experiencing that first returning session as discouraging or humiliating, a risk that, left unaddressed, frequently causes people to simply abandon their renewed attempt at consistency entirely after just one or two disappointing comparison-driven sessions, precisely the same kind of premature quitting examined throughout earlier chapters of this audiobook, just triggered specifically by the unique circumstances surrounding a return from disruption rather than an ordinary low-motivation morning. The people who successfully sustain training consistency across an entire lifetime, spanning multiple decades, are almost never people who somehow avoided every single disruption, illness, injury, and overwhelming life circumstance along the way. They are simply people who developed a healthy, realistic, considerably less dramatic relationship with the process of returning after disruption, treating each return as nothing more significant than the resumption of an ongoing long-term practice, rather than as a referendum on their own underlying character, commitment, or fundamental capability. Chapter 20. Here's the single idea worth carrying forward from everything this audiobook has covered. The idea connecting that empty gym this entire journey began with directly to wherever you happen to be sitting or standing right now as these final words reach you. The discipline that genuinely changes everything was never actually about possessing more motivation than everyone else, never about some rare inborn capacity for relentless willpower unavailable to ordinary people facing ordinary, complicated, busy lives. It was always about a specific, learnable set of underlying principles, building identity-based habits that no longer require fresh daily decisions, deliberately engineering environments that reduce unnecessary friction between intention and action, understanding and surviving the predictable valley of disappointment that arrives long before visible results finally do, learning to tolerate productive discomfort while clearly distinguishing it from genuine warning signs requiring real caution, managing internal self-talk deliberately rather than passively accepting whatever defeatist narrative happens to arise automatically during difficult moments, seeking genuine social accountability and support rather than attempting everything in complete isolation, comparing progress honestly against one's own documented personal history rather than against unfair, curated external highlights, treating single missed sessions as expected, inconsequential events while still actively preventing the dangerous escalation toward complete, sustained abandonment, respecting deliberate, planned recovery as an equally essential component of genuine discipline rather than a reluctant departure from it, and approaching any inevitable disruption and eventual return with realistic, graduated expectations rather than all or nothing, thinking that quietly sabotages so many otherwise genuine attempts at lasting change. None of these principles require you to already be the kind of person who trains consistently before you can begin applying them. They require only the willingness to begin acting like that person today, in whatever small, specific, immediately actionable way realistically fits your own current circumstances, trusting that the underlying identity, much like the underlying physical adaptation itself, follows consistent action rather than necessarily preceding it. The person training alone in that dark, empty gym at 5 in the morning was never fundamentally different from you in any way that actually matters to this conversation. They simply made a series of small, specific, repeatable decisions, sustained consistently across enough difficult mornings and enough uneventful weeks, until those small decisions eventually compounded into a transformation large enough to look, from the outside, like something almost unbelievable. That exact same compounding process remains entirely available to you, starting with whatever specific, realistic first step makes sense for your own current life, your own current schedule, and your own current level of fitness, regardless of how many previous attempts may have already ended in frustration or eventual abandonment. The discipline that changes everything has never required perfection, has never required permanent motivation, and has never required becoming a fundamentally different kind of person overnight. It has only ever required exactly what it is asking of you right now, at the precise moment these final words reach you, the willingness to make one small, specific, deliberate decision today, and then to make that same decision again tomorrow, and again the day after that, for considerably longer than feels comfortable or immediately rewarding, trusting fully that the version of yourself currently waiting somewhere on the other side of that sustained, unglamorous consistency is genuinely worth the entire uncomfortable, uneventful, quietly transformative journey required to finally meet them.